The hiss of the espresso machine and the polite murmur of conversations were the white noise of Ilara's existence. At 20, her life was a meticulously balanced equation of lukewarm coffee, heavy textbooks, and the relentless ache in her feet. But on a frigid Thursday night at Aria, a restaurant whose ambitions far outstripped its clientele's wallets, the equation was about to be shattered. It wasn't the crash of a dropped tray or a customer's complaint. It was a voice, a low baritone that cut through the clatter with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "The girl, with the wine! Stop her!" Ilara froze mid-stride, a bottle of expensive Bordeaux hovering precariously over a pristine white tablecloth. The command had come from the most coveted table in the house, Booth 12, a secluded alcove usually reserved for city councilmen or clandestine lovers. Tonight it was occupied by the Vances. Alexander Vance, a man in his late 50s whose face was etched onto the city's skyline via the towers of Vance Holdings, and his son Julian, a man around 30 whose tailored suit seemed to be woven from pure, unadulterated impatience. Ilara had been avoiding them all night, not because they were difficult, on the contrary, they were coldly polite, but because they radiated an aura of immense, gravitational power that made the air around them thin. Now that power was focused directly on her. Alexander Vance was staring, not at her face but at her arm. As she had reached to pour the wine, the starched cuff of her white shirt had ridden up, exposing the delicate skin of her inner forearm. And there, just below her wrist, was the mark she'd had her entire life. A tiny, intricate birthmark, a perfect, coffee-colored crescent moon, with the faint, ghostly outline of a full circle nestled within it, like a lunar eclipse captured on skin. Before she could process the stare, Julian was on his feet. He wasn't aggressive, but his movement was so swift, so purposeful, it felt like a form of aggression in itself. "My father would like a word," he said, his voice quiet but non-negotiable. He wasn't looking at her. He was managing a situation, a problem that had suddenly appeared in his otherwise orderly evening. Alexander Vance hadn't moved. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, were still locked on her arm. "Where?" he began, and the single word was so freighted with intensity that Ilara felt a tremor of fear run through her. "Where did you get that?" He gestured with his chin towards her wrist. His composure was absolute, but there was a terrifying hunger in his gaze, a look of recognition so profound it felt like a violation. I was born with it," Ilara stammered, her professional smile dissolving into a mask of confusion. The other patrons were beginning to notice, their conversations faltering. Her manager, a perpetually flustered man named Dimitri, was already gliding towards them, his face pinched with concern. "Is everything all right, Mr. Vance?" Dimitri asked, his voice oozing deference. Alexander ignored him completely. He finally lifted his gaze from her arm to her face, and the look in his eyes was not one of discovery, but of confirmation. It was as if he'd been searching for this specific mark for a very, very long time. He rose slowly from the booth, a tall, imposing figure who commanded the space around him. He didn't reach for her, didn't cause a scene in the traditional sense. He did something far more unnerving. He looked directly at his son, then back at Ilara, and spoke with the chilling finality of a judge passing sentence. "The search is over, Julian," he declared to the now silent restaurant. "It's her." Ilara Vance, no, Ilara Shaw, she corrected herself for the 1,000th time, had constructed her identity from scraps. An orphan left at a church doorstep, her life was a collection of hand-me-down names and second-hand histories from a string of indifferent foster homes. Her past was a blank page, and her future was a daunting mountain of student loan debt. At 20, her grand ambition was to graduate from the City College's art history program, a dream that seemed to recede with every 10-hour shift she worked. Her specialization was obscure, almost comically so, provenance and historical authentication. She spent her few precious free hours learning to identify the subtle watermarks in 17th century paper, the chemical composition of Renaissance pigments, the telltale signs of a masterful forgery. It was a fascination born of her own rootlessness. If she couldn't authenticate her own history, she could at least become an expert in authenticating the history of others. Her only personal artifact, her sole link to that blank page of a past, was the birthmark, the lunar eclipse. It was her secret compass, a tiny personal hieroglyph that belonged only to her. The incident at Aria shattered the quiet anonymity she had curated so carefully. Dmitri had fired her on the spot, not for any fault of her own, but because the Vances were the Vances, and their discomfort was more valuable than her employment. She had stumbled home in a daze, the weight of Alexander Vance's stare feeling like a physical brand on her skin. 2 days later, a long black sedan, silent as a shark, pulled up outside her crumbling apartment building. A man in a suit, the same driver who had picked up the Vances from the restaurant, emerged and handed her a thick cream-colored envelope. There was no greeting, no explanation. He simply handed it to her and drove away. Inside was a letter, embossed with the formidable V of the Vance Holdings logo, and a check for $50,000. The letter was brief and devoid of sentiment. It was a summons, not an invitation. Alexander Vance requested her presence at his estate the following day. The check, it explained, was a preliminary gesture of goodwill and a retainer for her time. "You can't go," said Maya, her roommate and a fiercely pragmatic law student, as she examined the check as if it might bite. "This is insane, Alara. Rich people don't just hand out 50 grand. This is we own you now money. He's buying your silence or your compliance." "But what does he want?" Alara whispered, tracing the raised V on the letterhead. The phrase, "the search is over," echoed in her mind. "Who cares? Cash the check, change your name, and move to another state," Maya advised, ever the pragmatist. "Men like that don't have family reunions. They have corporate takeovers. You're not a person to them. You're an asset or a liability." Maya was right, of course. Every instinct screamed at Alara to run. But the art historian in her, the part that was obsessed with uncovering forgotten stories, was captivated. This was the ultimate question of provenance. Her own. For 20 years, she had been a story without a beginning. Now, a man who looked like he could buy and sell history itself was claiming to know the first chapter. Against all logic, she folded the letter and put the uncashed check in a textbook. She would go. Not for the money, but for the answer. The Vance estate was not a home. It was a monument to power, a sprawling modernist structure of glass and steel perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It felt less like a residence and more like the headquarters of a Bond villain. Alara was led by a silent housekeeper through halls that felt more like art galleries, the walls adorned with paintings that made her art historian heart ache with their sheer value and their cold, impersonal display. She found Alexander and Julian in a vast, minimalist living room with a floor-to-ceiling window that framed the turbulent gray sea. Alexander stood before the window, his hands clasped behind his back, a king surveying his domain. Julian was at a sleek chrome bar, pouring a glass of water, his movements precise and economical. "Ms. Shaw," Alexander said, turning. His voice was calmer now, but the intensity in his eyes was undiminished. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Alara perched on the edge of a severe-looking white leather sofa that probably cost more than her entire college tuition. "I assume you have questions," Alexander continued, taking a seat opposite her. "You said, at the restaurant, you said the search was over," Alara began, her voice barely a whisper. "What search?" Alexander leaned forward, his expression unreadable. 21 years ago, my late wife, Helena, was forced to make an impossible decision. Before we were married, she had a child, a daughter, her family. They were old money, concerned with appearances and bloodlines. The father was not someone they approved of. They forced her to give the child up for adoption, a closed, sealed adoption. They erased every trace of the child's existence. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the sterile room. Helena told me this on her deathbed. It was her deepest regret. She made me promise I would find her daughter. She had no name, no records, nothing to go on. Just one detail, a unique birthmark her baby was born with, a lunar eclipse on her left forearm. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She instinctively covered her arm with her hand. Julian, who had been silent until now, spoke up. He walked over, not with hostility, but with the weary air of a man who had been through this before. "My father has spent millions over the last decade on this search," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. "We've investigated hundreds of women, hired dozens of private investigators. We've been targeted by countless frauds and opportunists. So you'll forgive my skepticism." "This is not skepticism, Julian. It is diligence," Alexander corrected him, his gaze never leaving Ilara. "We simply need to be certain." "Certain how?" Ilara asked, her mind reeling. "A DNA test," Alexander said simply. "We have a sample of Helena's DNA, preserved. We will compare yours to it. It will be handled by our private medical team, with the utmost discretion. If it is a match, then you are Helena's daughter, and you will be welcomed into this family as one of our own." The phrase, "one of our own," sounded less like a welcome and more like an acquisition. "And if it's not a match," she asked. Julian answered before his father could. "Then we will compensate you for your time and this profound inconvenience, and we will all move on with our life," he said, his meaning clear. "You will disappear." The offer was staggering, the implications terrifying. To go from a nobody to the secret daughter of a Vance. It was the stuff of fairy tales, but this felt cold, transactional. She looked from Alexander's intense, possessive stare to Julian's cool, appraising one. These men weren't looking for a lost girl to love. They were looking to fill a space, to complete a collection. I need to think about it," Ilara said, standing up. The $50,000 check felt like a lead weight in her bag. It wasn't a gift. It was the first link in a chain. "Of course," Alexander said, his voice smooth as silk. "Take all the time you need. Our car is waiting to take you home. And Ms. Shaw, Ilara, whatever the outcome, your financial concerns are over. Consider your student loans paid. Consider your life changed. We take care of our own." As the silent car whisked her away from the glass and steel palace, Ilara looked down at the birthmark on her arm. For 20 years it had been a mystery. Now it was a potential key to a kingdom, or a trap door to a life she couldn't begin to imagine. And she had the sickening feeling that the choice to turn the key was no longer hers to make. The week that followed was a surreal limbo. Ilara didn't cash the check, but its presence altered the very atmosphere of her cramped apartment. It sat on her desk, a potent symbol of the life being offered to her, a life of impossible wealth and terrifying obligations. True to his word, Alexander Vance began to orchestrate her life from a distance. An email from the City College's bursar's office informed her that an anonymous benefactor had paid her entire tuition, past and future, in full. A new lease agreement appeared under her door for a luxury apartment downtown, already paid for a year in advance. It was an assault by generosity, a campaign to make her old life obsolete and her new one inevitable. Ilara resisted. She stayed in her apartment, continued attending her classes, and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But the Vance's gravity was too strong. She felt it in the subtle, curious glances of her professors and the sudden, deferential tone of her landlord. Wordlessly, the world had been informed that she was now under the protection or ownership of a very powerful family. She spent her nights not studying for exams, but researching Helena Vance. She found a ghost, a beautiful, sad-eyed woman who appeared in society pages for 2 decades, always perfectly dressed, always standing slightly behind her husband. She was a patron of the arts, a silent fixture on museum boards. She had died of a sudden illness 2 years prior. There was no mention of a previous life, no hint of a lost child. The official history was as pristine and sealed as the adoption records Alexander had mentioned. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that Ilara found a clue, a breadcrumb that didn't fit the official narrative. A small, digitized art blog from a decade ago reviewed a gallery show for emerging artists. The reviewer mentioned a painting that had been purchased by Helena Vance. The artist's name was Elias Thorne. A footnote described him as a reclusive but brilliant painter who had vanished from the art scene 20 years ago after his studio, and all his work was destroyed in a fire. The date of the fire was just a few months before Helena married Alexander Vance. A coincidence? It had to be, but the name Elias Thorne lodged itself in her mind. Finally, she agreed to the DNA test. A discreet professional woman came to her apartment, took a simple cheek swab, and left. The process was sterile and anticlimactic, yet it felt like the most significant moment of her life. She had handed over the very code of her being to be judged. During the agonizing wait for the results, Julian Vance surprised her. He called and asked to meet her, not at the estate or some high-end restaurant, but at a small, dusty used bookstore near her college. He was different out of his corporate armor. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, he looked less like an heir and more like a man burdened by his inheritance. "I want to apologize," he began, not meeting her eyes, instead running a hand over a display of worn paperbacks. "My behavior has been clinical. It's how I'm wired. My father sees the world in terms of legacy and emotion. I see it in terms of risk and assets. When you appeared, all I saw was risk." "And what do you see now?" Ilara asked, her voice quiet. "A variable I can't account for," he admitted, finally looking at her. "I did some research on you. Your academic record is impeccable. Your focus of study, provenance, authentication. It's ironic, wouldn't you say?" "I guess," she said. "My father operates on grand narratives," Julian continued, his voice low. "He builds stories for his company, for his life. He needs them to be perfect. My mother, Helena, she was his perfect story. The beautiful, cultured woman from an old family who completed his empire. A lost child is a flaw in that narrative, a loose thread he needs to weave back in. He needs you to be Helena's daughter." The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. He didn't say he hoped she was. He said his father needed her to be. "You still think I'm a fraud," Alora stated, not as a question. "No," Julian said, shaking his head. "I think you're real, and that, in my father's world, might be the most dangerous thing you can be. He'll want to shape you, to edit your past, to make you fit the Vance narrative. I'm suggesting you be careful." It was the most genuine moment she had shared with either of the Vance men. It was a warning, dressed as an apology. Julian wasn't her enemy, but he wasn't her ally either. He was an observer, waiting to see how this new variable would affect his own complicated equation. The day the results were due, another black car arrived to ferry her to the estate. This time, she felt like a prisoner on her way to sentencing. She was led into Alexander's private study. It was a room that suffocated you with history and power. Dark wood paneling, shelves of leather-bound books that looked purely decorative, and a massive desk made from a single slab of polished mahogany. A laptop sat on the desk, glowing like an oracle. Alexander stood behind it. Julian was by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the sea. "The lab sent the report this morning," Alexander announced, his voice tight with anticipation. He gestured for her to approach. "I wanted us to see it together." He clicked open the file. A PDF filled the screen, a dense document of genetic markers and scientific jargon. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The blank page of her life was about to be filled in. Alexander scrolled down to the conclusion, his finger tracing the line on the screen. He read it, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. It was a look of utter, vindicated certainty. "It's a match," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned the laptop towards her. 99.998% probability. You are Helena's daughter." The words hung in the air, momentous and terrifying. A wave of dizziness washed over Ilara. It was true, all of it. She had a mother, a family, a history. Alexander came around the desk and placed his hands on her shoulders. His grip was firm, proprietary. "Welcome home," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Welcome to the family, Ilara Vance." The name sounded alien, a costume she was being forced to wear. Julian turned from the window. There was no joy on his face, only a complex, somber resignation. He looked at Ilara, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes before his expression became a mask of neutrality. The celebration, if it could be called that, was a meticulously planned affair 2 nights later. It was not a party, but a strategic unveiling. Alexander had summoned the inner circle, the family lawyers, the chairman of the Vance Holdings board, a few carefully selected old money allies. It was an event designed to officially absorb Elara into the Vance dynasty, to present her as a long-lost treasure, now safely recovered. Elara felt like an exhibit. Dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue dress chosen by Alexander's personal shopper, she moved through the cavernous rooms of the estate, accepting polite, curious handshakes and murmurs of astonishment. She felt the weight of their stares, sizing her up, calculating her value, her place in the hierarchy. The climax of the evening was to take place in the Grand Library. Alexander gathered everyone, a patriarch presenting his newfound heir. For years we have mourned Helena, a woman of unparalleled grace and taste, he began, his voice resonating with practiced gravitas. But we were unaware of a secret sorrow she carried. Tonight we right a historical wrong. We welcome her daughter, Elara, into the light. He gestured to a large velvet-draped object on an easel. Helena was a collector of art, but she was also a patron of artists. She believed in nurturing talent. To commemorate this moment, to connect Elara with the mother she never knew, I have managed to acquire a final piece of her history for you, Elara. Something I want you to have. With a flourish, he pulled away the velvet cloth. On the easel was a portrait. It depicted a young woman, no older than Elara, with hauntingly familiar eyes and a sad, gentle smile. She was sitting in a sun-drenched room, a book in her lap. The style was raw, emotional, full of thick, expressive brushstrokes. It was beautiful. "This is Helena," Alexander announced, "painted in the year before we met, a piece from her youth that her family kept hidden away. And it was painted by a brilliant young artist she was helping to support, a man named Elias Thorne." The name struck Elara like a physical blow. Elias Thorne. The artist from the blog. Alexander wasn't finished. He stepped forward and handed her a small, leather-bound journal. "And this," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant for the whole room to hear, "is Helena's diary from that year. It speaks of her turmoil, her difficult choices, and her deep admiration for the artist. It will help you understand her sacrifice." A wave of murmurs went through the room. It was a perfect story, a masterpiece of narrative construction, worthy of Alexander Vance. The tragic young mother, the brilliant but unsuitable artist, the secret child, the reunion, a flawless provenance for his new daughter. Elara took the painting and the diary, her hands trembling. She felt everyone's eyes on her, expecting tears, gratitude. She looked at Julian, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a grim, unreadable mask. His warning echoed in her ears. "My father operates on grand narratives. He needs them to be perfect." Something was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong. She looked at the portrait again, but this time she wasn't looking as a lost daughter. She was looking as an authenticator. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of observation, began to work. She moved closer, her fingers hovering over the canvas. The light from the library lamps caught the texture of the paint. She saw it instantly, a tiny detail that 99% of people would miss. The cracking pattern in the oil paint, the craquelure, it was too uniform, too perfect. Natural aging creates a spiderweb of irregular cracks. This looked like it had been created artificially, with a heat lamp or a chemical agent. Her gaze flickered to the artist's signature in the bottom corner. E.T. Simple, elegant. But the paint of the signature sat on top of the age-induced cracks, not within them. A forger's classic mistake. The signature had been added after the canvas was artificially aged. Her blood ran cold. She opened the diary. The paper felt old, brittle. The ink was faded, but she tilted a page toward the light, her heart pounding. And there it was, faint, almost invisible, but undeniably present. A watermark embedded in the fibers of the paper. It was the logo of a small, artisanal paper mill in Italy. A mill she had studied, a mill that hadn't opened until 5 years ago. The diary was a fake. The portrait was a fake. It was all a lie. A beautiful, expensive, masterfully crafted lie. The DNA test said she was Helena's daughter. That might be true. But this story, this perfect, tragic narrative Alexander was presenting, this was a forgery. He wasn't just giving her a history, he was inventing one. And the terrifying question was, why? What true, ugly history was this perfect story designed to conceal? A hush had fallen over the room. Everyone was watching her, waiting for her emotional reaction. Alexander was smiling, a look of paternal pride on his face. He believed he had won. He had acquired his lost heirloom and curated its history perfectly. Ilara closed the diary. She turned from the painting and faced him. The fear that had been her constant companion for a week was suddenly gone, burned away by a cold, clarifying rage. She was no longer a lost girl. She was an expert in her field, and she had just been handed the most significant forgery of her life. "It's beautiful," Ilara said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the expectant silence. "A truly remarkable piece of work." Alexander beamed. "I'm glad you think so. It belongs to you now, a link to your mother's soul." "Oh, it's a link, all right," Ilara continued, her gaze unwavering. "A link to a story, just not the one you think." She took a breath, feeling the collective focus of the room narrow on her. She saw Julian take a half step forward, his eyes wide with alarm, sensing. The silence that fell was not empty. It was a physical presence, a dense, heavy element that displaced the air in the grand library, pressing in on everyone's eardrums. It was the sound of a dynasty cracking, of a carefully constructed reality shattering into a million glittering shards. Ilara's final words, in the soft, definitive thud of the forged diary hitting the floor, were not an accusation. They were a verdict. The performance was over. The guests, men and women who navigated the world on currents of power and influence, did not flee. They evaporated. There was no panicked rush, but a quiet, almost choreographed dissolution, a series of averted eyes, murmured excuses, and the ghost-like tread of expensive shoes on antique rugs. Each departure was a fresh nail in the coffin of Alexander Vance's public image. They were witnesses, and their silence was now a commodity, soon to be traded in boardrooms and over dinner tables across the city. They had come to see the unveiling of an heiress and had instead been treated to the vivisection of a king. Alexander Vance did not collapse. The change was more terrifying than that. It was an implosion. The immense gravitational force he exerted on any room he occupied suddenly reversed, pulling inward until he seemed to shrink inside his impeccably tailored suit. The color drained from his face, leaving a waxy, sallow canvas on which a decade of hubris and control had been painted. His eyes, which had held the certainty of a god just minutes before, were now two dark voids of disbelief and incandescent rage. He stared at Ilara, not as a newfound daughter, but as a catastrophic system failure, an anomaly that his vast resources should have predicted and contained. Julian, by contrast, seemed to grow taller. The mask of weary cynicism he always wore had fallen away, and in its place was a stark, pale clarity. He looked from Ilara, whose trembling was now visible, a fine tremor of adrenaline and shock, to his father. The look in his eyes was one of utter, devastating disillusionment. He was not just seeing a liar, he was seeing the lie that had structured his entire existence. The sad, beautiful ghost of his mother, Helena, was not the tragic heroine of his father's narrative. She was its primary victim. "Get them out," Alexander finally rasped, the words gravelly and broken. He was speaking to Julian, but his gaze was locked on Ilara, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Get her out of my house." "No," Julian said. The word was quiet, but it had the finality of a closing vault door. It was the first time, perhaps in his entire life, that he had directly defied a command from his father. "We are not leaving, not until we are done." He took a half step, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara, a subtle but unmistakable alignment. It was not a gesture of protection, not yet. It was one of shared purpose. He was a man of assets and liabilities, and he had just realized his entire life had been built on fraudulent accounting. He needed a true audit. "You dare," Alexander began, pushing himself up from his chair, a flicker of the old tyrant returning. "I dare," Julian cut him off, his voice laced with a cold fury Ilara hadn't known he possessed. "For 20 years you told me my mother's greatest sadness was this lost child. You spent millions, You built this grand mythology of a deathbed promise. You made her grief into a tool for your own legacy. But it was all a fabrication, wasn't it? A beautifully crafted piece of corporate storytelling to hide a hostile takeover of a human heart. He gestured around the opulent library. This isn't a home, it's a museum to your acquisitions. And she was just the prize of the collection. Now you will tell us the truth, the real provenance. The next 48 hours were a descent into a cold clinical hell. Julian, with the ruthless efficiency he normally applied to corporate mergers, turned the full power of Vance Holdings inward. He wasn't searching for a story anymore. He was compiling a case file. Lawyers were summoned, not the old family retainers loyal to Alexander, but a new, hungrier breed from the litigation department. Private investigators who had once searched for Ilara were now tasked with excavating the ghost of Elias Thorne. Ilara existed in a state of suspended animation. Julian installed her in a suite at a neutral, luxury hotel, a sterile, silent space high above the city. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She sat by the vast window, watching the lights of the city that Alexander Vance had branded with his name, and tried to process the violent rewriting of her own soul. The blank page of her past had not been filled in. It had been scrawled over, erased, and written upon again. She felt a profound, aching grief for a mother she had never known, a woman who had been curated into a beautiful, tragic object. She mourned the life Helena could have had, a life filled with the sun-drenched light of that forged painting, a life with the man she had loved. And she grieved for a father, a man whose name she had only just learned, a man who had been systematically erased from existence. It was a unique, hollow kind of mourning, a sorrow for ghosts she was only just meeting. Julian would visit her in the evenings, his face etched with exhaustion. He brought files, documents, printouts. He didn't soften the blows. He presented the information with his characteristic lack of emotion, but she could see the toll it was taking on him. He was a man discovering the foundational pillars of his life were made of dust. They learned that Alexander hadn't just encouraged Helena to leave Elias, he had orchestrated a campaign of destruction. Using a series of shell companies, he had bought the small gallery that represented Thorne, terminating his contract. He'd purchased the building that housed his studio, engineering an eviction that led to the convenient, professionally executed, accidental fire. He had used his influence to have Elias blacklisted, ensuring no other reputable gallery in the country would touch him. It was not a rivalry, it was an annihilation. He didn't just remove a competitor, Julian said one night, sliding a folder across the polished table between them. His voice was flat. He unpersoned him. Inside the folder were the last known documents pertaining to Elias Thorne, a change of name application, a bus ticket to a forgotten town in coastal Maine, and then nothing. A digital ghost. The deepest cut came from a file recovered from the hard drive of Alexander's now-fired chief of security. It was a copy of Helena's original diary, the real one. For 20 years, Alexander had kept it locked in his safe. Julian had had the safe drilled open. He hadn't shown the physical diary to Ilara, an act of uncharacteristic sensitivity. He had simply transcribed a single passage, dated a week after her birth. He made me do it. The papers are signed. They have taken my little moonbeam, my Elias girl. They say she will have a better life. But how can a life without love be better? A has promised she will be safe, with a good family. He says this is the price of my future. But I feel as if he has carved out my heart and left a stone in its place. I got a message to E. I told him our daughter has his family's mark, the crescent moon. I told him to look for her. It is the only hope I have left, that one day my love will find my love. Ilara read the passage 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. My little moonbeam, my Elias girl. For the first time she heard her mother's voice. It wasn't the distant, graceful society figure from the magazines. It was the voice of a girl whose heart had been broken, a mother whose child had been stolen. And in that passage was the final damning truth. Alexander hadn't just erased her father. He had been the architect of her abandonment. Her entire life as an orphan, the years in indifferent foster homes, the constant ache of rootlessness. It was not fate. It was a strategic decision made by the man who now claimed to be welcoming her home. The rage that followed was a clean, cold fire. It burned away the grief and the shock, leaving behind a diamond-hard resolve. The final confrontation took place not in the library, but in Alexander's sterile, minimalist office at the top of Vance Tower. He had been summoned by his own board of directors at the behest of his son. Ilara insisted on being there. Alexander looked smaller behind his vast desk, the city skyline sprawling behind him like a kingdom he no longer ruled. He had aged years in 2 days. "The board has accepted your resignation," Julian stated, no preamble. "Effective immediately." Alexander let out a dry, rattling laugh. "My company, my name, you turn my own blood against me." He looked at Ilara. "All for her, a nobody, a waitress." "She has a name," Julian said, his voice dangerously low. "I gave her a name," Alexander roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "I was giving her the world. Everything I gave your mother." "You gave my mother a gilded cage," Ilara said, her voice steady and clear. She stepped forward, placing a single piece of paper on his desk. It was a copy of the diary entry. "You didn't save her from a life of poverty. You stole her from a life of love. And you stole me from both of them. You didn't search for me to fulfill a promise. You searched for me because I was an outstanding debt on your balance sheet, a loose narrative thread you couldn't stand to leave untidied. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted to complete the collection." He stared at the paper, his jaw working silently. For the first time, he seemed to have no words, no strategy. He was a master manipulator who had finally encountered a truth he couldn't spin. "It was for the best," he whispered, the words of a man trying to convince himself. "I gave you both a legacy." "A legacy is what you build," Ilara said, her voice ringing with a conviction she had never felt before. "It's not something you can buy or forge or steal. You built an empire of glass and steel, but the foundations are rotten. That is your legacy." She turned and walked out, Julian following her. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. In the aftermath, Julian, now the acting CEO, came to her with an offer. It was a settlement drawn up by a team of lawyers, transferring a significant portion of the Vance family trust, what would have been Helena's share, into her name. It was a number with so many zeros it looked like a mathematical equation. It was, "We own you now," money transformed into, "We are sorry" money. They sat in the same impersonal hotel suite. The city lights twinkled below them. "This is not a transaction," Julian said carefully, pushing the portfolio across the table. "It's a restitution. It's what she would have wanted you to have." Ilara looked at the documents, at the Vance logo embossed on the cover. For a week, she had been fighting for the truth of her identity. Accepting this felt like letting them brand her after all. "No," she said softly. Julian looked stunned. "Ilara, this is life-changing. It's freedom." "No, it's not," she replied, meeting his gaze. "It's their money. It's his money. It's the price he paid for my mother's heart. Every dollar is tainted by what he did. Accepting it would be like agreeing that the price was fair. It wasn't." She pushed the portfolio back towards him. "My freedom doesn't have a price tag." "Then what?" Julian asked, genuinely lost. "What do you want? What can I do?" And in that moment, Ilara knew. The art historian, the authenticator, the grieving daughter, all the pieces of her life coalesced into a single clear purpose. "I don't want the money," she said. "I want to use it. I want you to establish a foundation, not in the Vance name, in theirs, the Thorne Vance Foundation." Julian listened, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning understanding. "Its mission," Ilara continued, her voice gaining passion, "will be to find artists like him, people with immense talent but no connections, no family money, no access to the world that men like your father control. We'll give them grants, studio space, their first gallery shows. We'll give them what your father took from Elias Thorne, a future." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And the centerpiece of the foundation will be a gallery, the Elias Thorne Gallery. We're going to find his work, all of it. The investigators tracked him to a town in Maine. He lived there for almost 20 years. He never stopped painting. We are going to find his art, buy it back, and give him the retrospective he was denied. We're going to make sure the world knows his name. We're going to give him back his legacy. It was a perfect poetic justice. To use the Vance fortune, a fortune built on acquisition and control, to nurture the very kind of untamed, authentic creativity Alexander had tried to destroy. To launder the family's tainted legacy by building something beautiful from its ruins. Julian was silent for a full minute, looking at her. The clinical businessman was gone. In his place was a man finally seeing a different kind of value, a different kind of return on investment. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All right. Yes." The journey to Port Clyde, Maine, felt like a pilgrimage. 6 months had passed. 6 months of legal battles, of establishing the foundation, of Julian consolidating his control over the company, and beginning the slow, arduous process of changing its culture. 6 months of Alara working with a team of art reclamation specialists, following the faint trail of Elias Thorne, who had lived in Maine under the name of Elias Shaw. He had taken her name, or rather, the name the world had given her. The discovery had been another quiet heartbreak. They found that he had sold paintings sporadically at local art fairs and through a small gallery in a nearby town. He had lived simply, quietly. He had died 5 years ago, alone. His will, found in the files of a local solicitor, was simple. Everything he owned was to be held in a climate-controlled storage unit, paid in advance for 25 years for a daughter he had never met, should she ever come looking for the moon. The storage facility was a drab, utilitarian building on the edge of town, smelling of salt and cold sea air. As the manager cut the thick padlock, the heavy metal door rolling upward with a deafening screech, Alara held her breath. The air that rushed out was cool and dry, thick with the sacred smell of linseed oil, turpentine, and old canvas. And inside, shrouded in the dim light, was a life's work. It was overwhelming. Canvases were stacked dozens deep against every wall. Portfolios filled with sketches leaned against them. It was a treasure trove, a buried kingdom. She and Julian stepped inside, moving with the reverence of archaeologists entering a pharaoh's tomb. Alara reached out and gently pulled the first canvas from a stack. It was a portrait of a fisherman, his face a roadmap of sun and sea, his eyes holding the weary wisdom of the tides. The brushwork was electric, alive. Thick daubs of paint captured the texture of his weathered skin, the rough wool of his sweater. She could feel the artist's empathy, his fascination with the story etched into the man's face. She moved to the next and the next. There were landscapes of the ferocious Maine coast, gray waves crashing against granite cliffs under bruised purple skies. There were intimate still lifes of objects in his small cottage. A chipped mug, a worn book, a single wilting flower in a glass jar. Each painting was a universe, imbued with a profound sense of soulfulness and a deep, abiding loneliness. Then Julian called her name, his voice hushed. "Alara, look." He was holding open a large, leather-bound portfolio. Inside, protected by sheets of clean paper, were charcoal sketches, dozens of them, all of the same subject. A young woman with wide, hopeful, slightly sad eyes. Her hair fell over her shoulders as she read a book. She laughed, her head thrown back in another. She stared out a window in a third, a look of quiet longing on her face. It was Helena. Not the poised, polished Helena Vance from society photographs, but Helena the girl, alive, beloved, seen. It was her mother, viewed through the adoring eyes of her father. Alara sank to her knees, tracing the charcoal lines of her mother's face with a trembling finger, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. This was the true portrait, the one no forger could ever replicate. She spent what felt like hours looking through the sketches, absorbing the love that poured from every line. Finally, she stood up and turned to a large cloth-draped canvas standing on its own in the center of the unit. It felt different, important. With a deep breath, she pulled away the cloth. It was a self-portrait. The artist, Elias Thorne, stood in his studio, a space filled with light and the chaotic energy of creation. He was a man with a kind, fiercely intelligent face, a storm of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to look right through the canvas, through time, and see her standing there. His gaze was not sad. It was intense, passionate, full of an unyielding creative fire. He was holding a brush in his right hand, and his left arm rested on a nearby table. Ilara's breath hitched. Her eyes locked onto his left forearm, and there it was, rendered with a few perfect strokes of sienna and umber paint. Just below his wrist, a tiny, intricate mark, a perfect crescent moon with the ghostly outline of the full circle nestled within it. Her birthmark. His birthmark. She slowly, unconsciously raised her own left arm, holding it beside the painting. The same moon that had been her only clue, her only piece of personal history, was now a bridge. It was not a brand of ownership or a key to a fortune. It was a signature, written in blood and skin and starlight, passed from a father to a daughter who would never meet, but who were now finally in the same room. A profound peace settled over her, a feeling of coming home that Alexander Vance's sterile palace could never provide. Her provenance was not in a DNA report or a legal document. It was here, in the smell of paint, in the love captured in charcoal, in the shared mark of the moon on an artist's arm. Her life was no longer a blank page, nor a forged and tainted manuscript. It was a gallery waiting to be filled, and for the first time she was not just the curator, she was the artist.